The whispers followed Faith Zimmerman like a shadow across the dusty streets of Wasco, California. "That one's trouble," they'd say, just loud enough for her to hear as she passed by the general store. "Pretty as a picture, but fickle as the wind." In the spring of 1873, being branded unfaithful was worse than death for a woman, especially one with Faith's history. Faith clutched her market basket tighter, her knuckles whitening as she forced herself to keep her chin high. 3 years, a widow at the age of 24, and the town had already written its verdict on her character in permanent ink. The fact that her late husband, Thomas, had been the one who strayed seemed irrelevant to the good people of Wasco. "Morning, Miss Zimmerman," a deep voice called out, halting her determined stride. Faith turned to find Xavier Hayes leaning against the hitching post outside the telegraph office, his worn Stetson tipped back to reveal eyes the color of summer skies. Unlike most folks in town, Xavier's gaze held no judgment, only that same quiet warmth she'd come to anticipate whenever their paths crossed. "Mr. Hayes," she replied with a nod, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest. "Fine day, isn't it?" "Fine indeed," he agreed, straightening to his full height. At 30, Xavier was the most respected rancher in Kern County, having built the Double H into something remarkable after arriving from Texas 5 years prior. "Might I help you with your parcels?" Before Faith could protest, he gently took her basket. "Thank you, but I wouldn't want to burden you, or have people talking more than they already do." Xavier's expression hardened momentarily. "Let them talk. I've never much cared for gossip." They walked in comfortable silence down the boardwalk, Faith acutely aware of the stares following them. Mrs. Holbrook and her sewing circle paused their conversation outside the millinery shop, eyebrows raised in silent disapproval. The blacksmith, Mr. Jenkins, shook his head almost imperceptibly. "I know what they think of me," Faith said quietly as they turned onto the quieter side street leading to her modest home. "You shouldn't risk your good name by associating with me." Xavier stopped walking, his expression serious. "Miss Zimmerman, Faith, I form my own opinions based on what I see, not what I hear. And what I see is a woman of remarkable dignity who's shouldered more than her fair share of unfair judgment." "You barely know me," she countered, though his words warmed something long cold within her. "I'd like to change that," he replied simply. "Would you permit me to call on you properly this Sunday after church?" Faith stared at him, searching for the hidden motive, the cruel joke that must be lurking behind those earnest eyes. Finding none, she took a steadying breath. "People will talk." "Let them," Xavier said again, with such conviction that for a moment Faith allowed herself to believe it could be that simple. "Then yes, Mr. Hayes, you may call on me Sunday." The smile that broke across Xavier's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. What Faith didn't see was Bartholomew Wilson watching from across the street, his face darkening with each passing second. As the town banker and Thomas Zimmerman's former best friend, he had his own reasons for perpetuating the whispers about Faith's character. Reasons that would soon threaten everything. Sunday couldn't arrive quickly enough for Faith. She'd spent Saturday scrubbing her small home from top to bottom, dusting surfaces that hadn't seen attention in months, and using precious sugar to bake a fresh apple pie. Standing before her mirror, she smoothed the faded blue calico dress her best and pinned her auburn hair in a modest style. "You're being foolish," she told her reflection. "He'll come to his senses before long." Still, hope blossomed treacherously in her heart. The church service that morning was an exercise in restraint. Faith sat in her usual place in the last pew, ignoring the sidelong glances when Xavier tipped his hat to her before taking his seat several rows ahead. Pastor Miller's sermon on forgiveness seemed pointed, though whether at her or the congregation's treatment of her, Faith couldn't be certain. As the parishioners filed out afterward, Faith could hear the murmurs. "Poor man doesn't know what he's getting himself into. She'll break his heart just like she broke Thomas's. Disgraceful, carrying on so soon after her husband's passing." Faith quickened her pace, eager to escape the scrutiny, when she felt a gentle touch at her elbow. Xavier stood there, looking handsomer than any man had a right to in a simple dark suit. "May I escort you home, Miss Zimmerman?" he asked, offering his arm. Taking it required courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but Faith slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow anyway. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." They walked the 3 blocks to her cottage in silence, trailed by stares and whispers. By the time they reached her gate, Faith's nerves were frayed to breaking. "Mr. Hayes, Xavier, please." "Xavier," she amended, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I think perhaps this isn't wise. Your reputation is mine to risk as I see fit," he finished firmly. "Unless you wish me to leave because you don't enjoy my company," Faith hesitated. "It's not that." "Then may I come in for that coffee you promised?" She hadn't promised coffee, but Faith found herself nodding anyway. Leading him into her small but meticulously clean sitting room, she busied herself with the preparations, grateful for the momentary distraction. "How long have you lived in Wasco?" Xavier asked, settling into the threadbare armchair. "All my life," Faith replied, setting down the coffee tray. "My father was one of the first settlers here back in '52. He had dreams of striking it rich in the gold fields, but instead found himself farming." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He always said he'd found something more valuable than gold, though a place to put down roots." "And your husband, was he from Wasco as well?" The question was asked gently, but Faith still felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "Thomas moved here from Sacramento when I was 16. He took over the livery stable from old Mr. Peterson." She poured the coffee with a steady hand, passing Xavier a cup. "We married when I was 20. And he passed 3 years ago," Faith nodded. "Pneumonia. It came on suddenly and took him within a week." What she didn't mention was how Thomas had been returning from visiting his mistress in Bakersfield when he was caught in a sudden downpour. Or how, in his fever-induced delirium, he had confessed everything not just about the woman in Bakersfield, but about others before her. How Faith had nursed him anyway, holding his hand until his final breath, because despite his betrayals she'd made vows. "I'm sorry for your loss," Xavier said sincerely. Faith met his gaze. "Thank you, but I suspect you've heard the other stories as well." Xavier set down his cup. "I've heard the gossip, yes, that you were cold to him, that you drove him to seek comfort elsewhere, that you were relieved when he died." His directness was startling. "I've never put much stock in such talk." "Why not?" The question escaped before Faith could stop it. "Because I believe in forming my own judgments based on a person's character, not hearsay." He leaned forward slightly. "And everything I've observed about you speaks to a woman of integrity, kindness, and remarkable strength." Faith felt tears threatening and blinked them away. "You give me too much credit." "I don't think I give you enough." Xavier's smile was warm. Now I heard mention of apple pie. The afternoon passed in conversation that flowed more easily than Faith would have believed possible. Xavier told her about growing up on a small ranch outside Dallas, losing his parents to a fever when he was 19, and working his way west with nothing but determination and skill with horses. "I was lucky to win the Double H in that poker game," he admitted with a rueful smile. The previous owner was more interested in gambling than ranching. The place was nearly run into the ground. "And now it's the most prosperous ranch in the county," Faith observed. "That's not luck, Xavier. That's hard work and vision." As the clock struck 5, Xavier reluctantly rose to leave. May I call on you again, Faith?" The sound of her given name in his deep voice sent a pleasant shiver through her. "I would like that," she admitted. At the door, he hesitated, then reached for her hand, brushing his lips across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it nearly undid her. "Until next time." Faith stood at her door long after Xavier had ridden away, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. For the first time in years, something like hope unfurled in her chest, fragile, tenuous, but unmistakably there. What she didn't know was that across town, Bartholomew Wilson was already setting plans in motion to ensure that hope would be short-lived. Over the next few weeks, Xavier became a regular visitor to Faith's cottage. Every Sunday after church, regardless of the pointed looks and whispers, he would escort her home and spend the afternoon in her company. Occasionally, he would bring small gifts, fresh flowers, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Faith treasured these tokens not for their material value, which was modest, but for the thoughtfulness behind them. It had been so long since anyone had considered her wants or preferences. On a particularly fine May afternoon, Xavier arrived with his buggy rather than on horseback. "I thought we might take a drive," he suggested, his eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "I have something I'd like to show you." Faith hesitated, glancing down at her simple house dress. "I'm not properly dressed for an outing." "You look perfect," Xavier assured her, "but we won't be seeing anyone else if that concerns you." Intrigued, Faith fetched her bonnet and shawl. Xavier helped her into the buggy with careful hands, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. As they drove out of town, Faith felt the weight of Wasco's judgment lifting with each hoofbeat. "Where are you taking me?" she asked as they turned onto a less traveled road heading west. "Patience," Xavier replied with a grin. "It's only a little farther." 20 minutes later, he guided the horses into a small clearing beside a creek. Ancient oak trees provided dappled shade, and wildflowers carpeted the ground in bursts of yellow, purple, and white. The water bubbled merrily over smooth stones, creating a soothing melody that instantly set Faith at ease. "It's beautiful," she breathed, accepting Xavier's hand as he helped her down from the buggy. "I found this place my first year in California," he explained, leading her to a fallen log perfectly situated as a bench overlooking the creek. "I come here when I need to think clearly, away from everything else." Faith sat beside him, suddenly aware of how alone they were. "And what did you need to think about today?" she asked softly. Xavier turned to face her, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "Faith, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but I feel as though I've been waiting to meet you my whole life." Her heart began to race. "Xavier, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know what people say about you. I know they whisper that you couldn't be faithful to Thomas, that you drove him away. I want you to know that I don't believe a word of it, not one word." Tears sprang to Faith's eyes. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I see you, Faith Zimmerman. I see your kindness when you help Mrs. Garcia with her children, even though she crosses the street to avoid speaking to you. I see your dignity when you hold your head high despite the whispers. I see your integrity in every interaction." He took her hands in his. "And I love what I see, all of it." The word love hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Faith felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, terrified to fall yet desperate to fly. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to say anything yet," Xavier assured her. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm a patient man, Faith. I can wait until you're ready." A tear slipped down her cheek. "What if I'm never ready? What if I'm too damaged by the past?" Xavier reached up to gently brush away the tear with his thumb. "Then I'll still be here as your friend, for as long as you'll have me." In that moment, with the creek murmuring beside them and the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves, Faith made a decision. Leaning forward, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that held all the words she couldn't yet say. When they finally broke apart, Xavier's smile was radiant. "I take it that means you might be ready sooner rather than later," Faith laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "It means I'm willing to try." They spent the afternoon by the creek, talking and sharing confidences. Faith finally told Xavier the full truth about her marriage to Thomas, the initial happiness, the gradual realization of his infidelities, the final devastating confession on his deathbed. "The worst part," she admitted, "was that even after all he'd done, the town somehow decided I was the faithless one, that I must have driven him to other women's arms through some failing of my own." Xavier's jaw tightened. "That's absurd and cruel." "It's the way of things," Faith said with resignation. "A woman alone becomes an easy target for people's worst assumptions." "Not anymore," Xavier said firmly, taking her hand. "You're not alone now, Faith." The sun was beginning its descent when they reluctantly packed up the small picnic they'd improvised from the supplies Xavier had thoughtfully brought. As they drove back toward town, Faith felt lighter than she had in years, as though she'd set down a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. That lightness vanished the moment they entered Wasco's Main Street. Outside the bank stood Bartholomew Wilson, his face darkening as he spotted Faith and Xavier in the buggy together. Beside him was a striking blonde woman Faith had never seen before, dressed in an elegant traveling suit that spoke of money and city sophistication. Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. "Ignore them," he murmured. But as they passed, Wilson called out, "Hayes! A moment of your time, if you please." Xavier hesitated, then brought the buggy to a stop. "What is it, Wilson? I'm escorting Miss Zimmerman home." "Yes, I can see that," Wilson replied, his voice dripping with insinuation. "I simply wanted to introduce you to our visitor from San Francisco. Miss Alina Taylor, may I present Xavier Hayes, owner of the Double H Ranch." The blonde woman stepped forward, offering a gloved hand and a dazzling smile. "Mr. Hayes, I've heard so much about you and your beautiful property. I'm considering some investments in the area." Xavier nodded politely but didn't take her hand. "Welcome to Wasco, Miss Taylor, but if you'll excuse us, and this must be Faith Zimmerman," Miss Taylor interrupted, her gaze sliding to Faith with calculated assessment. "Mr. Wilson has told me all about you as well." Faith felt a chill despite the warm evening. "Has he indeed? How fascinating, considering we've never been properly introduced." Wilson's smile was shark-like. "I was just telling Miss Taylor about our little town's, shall we say, colorful history, including the tragic story of Thomas Zimmerman and his unfortunate marriage." Xavier stiffened beside Faith. "That's enough, Wilson." "I'm simply making conversation," Wilson protested with false innocence. "After all, everyone in town knows the story. How poor Thomas sought comfort elsewhere when his wife proved so disappointing." Faith felt the familiar shame washing over her, but before she could speak, Xavier handed her the reins and jumped down from the buggy. In 2 strides he was toe-to-toe with Wilson, his voice low but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent street. "The next time you speak of Miss Zimmerman in that manner, you'll answer to me. Is that clear?" Wilson paled slightly but held his ground. "Defending her honor, Hayes." "That's admirable, if misguided. Ask yourself why a man like Thomas would stray unless given reason." "The only thing I'm asking myself," Xavier replied evenly, "is why Thomas considered a snake like you a friend." He turned back to the buggy, ignoring Miss Taylor's startled expression, and climbed up beside Faith. Without another word, he took the reins and guided the horses forward, leaving Wilson and the curious crowd behind. "I'm sorry," Faith whispered once they were out of earshot. Xavier's expression was thunderous, but his voice remained gentle. "You have nothing to apologize for. Wilson is the one who should be sorry, and he will be." "What did you mean about Thomas considering him a friend?" Xavier sighed. "Wilson and your husband were apparently thick as thieves." "I've heard they were business partners in some ventures." Faith frowned. "Thomas never mentioned that." "Perhaps there was a reason," Xavier suggested, pulling the buggy to a stop outside Faith's cottage. "Wilson seems unusually invested in tarnishing your reputation." As he helped Faith down, Xavier kept hold of her hands. "Don't let him get under your skin. Whatever his game is, we'll face it together." "Together," Faith repeated, the word still strange and wonderful on her tongue. Xavier brushed a soft kiss across her forehead. "I'll see you Sunday." Faith nodded, watching him drive away with a curious mixture of joy and foreboding. Something about Wilson's smug confidence troubled her deeply. Whatever game the banker was playing, she sensed it was only just beginning. The next morning, Faith was arranging flowers in her small front garden when a shadow fell across the blooms. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Eleanor Taylor. "Miss Zimmerman," the blonde woman greeted her, her voice cultured and pleasant. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced." Faith straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not at all, though I confess I'm surprised by your visit." "I wanted to apologize for yesterday's unpleasantness," Eleanor said, her expression seeming genuinely contrite. Mr. Wilson's behavior was inexcusable. Taken aback, Faith studied the other woman carefully. "Thank you, though I'm accustomed to such treatment in Wasco." "Which is precisely why I wanted to speak with you," Eleanor continued. "May I be blunt, Miss Zimmerman?" "I prefer honesty to platitudes," Faith replied. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "As do I. The truth is, I'm not here in Wasco merely to consider investments. I'm here because of Xavier Hayes." Faith's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I see. My father and Xavier's father were business associates in Texas," Eleanor explained. "When I learned Xavier had established himself in California, I decided to look him up. Our families always hoped we might form an alliance." "An alliance," Faith repeated, the word tasting bitter. "You mean a marriage?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "Precisely. My father's banking interests would complement Xavier's ranching operations perfectly. It would be a most advantageous match. And you're telling me this because?" "Because I'm not the sort of woman who engages in underhanded tactics," Eleanor said, her blue eyes direct. "I wanted you to understand the situation clearly. Xavier may be infatuated with you now, but eventually he'll recognize where his true interests lie. Men like him don't marry women with complicated pasts." Faith felt each word like a physical blow, but years of facing town gossip had taught her to mask her pain. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Taylor. If that's all, one more thing," Eleanor added, reaching into her handbag to withdraw an envelope. "Mr. Wilson asked me to deliver this to you. He said it concerns matters related to your late husband's estate that require immediate attention." Faith accepted the envelope reluctantly. "Good day, Miss Taylor." "Good day, Miss Zimmerman." Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I don't believe the gossip about you. But that doesn't change the fact that Xavier Hayes is destined for greater things than Wasco can offer." After Eleanor departed, Faith sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The envelope in her hands seemed to burn with ominous potential. Breaking the seal, she unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in Bartholomew Wilson's precise handwriting. "Miss Zimmerman," it began formally, "it has come to the bank's attention that certain financial irregularities existed in your late husband's accounts. An audit reveals that Thomas Zimmerman borrowed substantial sums against your property before his untimely death. These loans, with accrued interest, now total $2,000 due immediately. Failure to settle this debt will result in foreclosure proceedings. However, I am prepared to discuss alternative arrangements if you call at my office tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bartholomew Wilson, President, First Bank of Wasco. Faith read the letter 3 times, disbelief giving way to horror. $2,000 might as well be $2 million. It was an impossible sum. The cottage was all she had left, her only security in a town that had already judged and condemned her. Her first instinct was to go to Xavier, but Alina Taylor's words echoed in her mind. Men like him don't marry women with complicated pasts. Would this final complication be the one that proved too much? And even if Xavier offered to pay the debt, could Faith bear to be so deeply in his obligation? That night, sleep eluded her entirely. By morning, Faith had made her decision. She would meet with Wilson alone and learn exactly what alternative arrangements he had in mind. Only then would she decide whether to involve Xavier. Dressing with particular care in her most businesslike gray dress, Faith steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. The bank occupied the most imposing building on Wasco's Main Street, its stone facade suggesting permanence and authority. Faith climbed the steps with her head high, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Wilson's secretary, a pinch-faced woman who had never hidden her disapproval of Faith, announced her with obvious distaste. "Miss Zimmerman to see you, sir." "Send her in, Mrs. Perkins," Wilson's voice called from within. The banker stood as Faith entered his wood-paneled office, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. "Thank you for coming, Miss Zimmerman." "Your letter didn't leave much choice," Faith replied coolly, seating herself with deliberate grace. Wilson resumed his seat, steepling his fingers. "Directness. I've always admired that about you, Faith. May I call you Faith?" "I prefer Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Wilson," he smiled, undeterred. "As you wish. I assume you're here to discuss the matter of your husband's debts." "Debts I knew nothing about until yesterday," Faith pointed out, "which seems strange, given that I was his wife." "Thomas was a proud man," Wilson said with affected sympathy. "He didn't want to worry you with financial concerns, especially after his indiscretions came to light." Faith's hands clenched in her lap. "What exactly did Thomas borrow money for, Mr. Wilson?" The banker hesitated, then withdrew a folder from his desk drawer. "Various investments, some more prudent than others. The unfortunate truth is that most failed to yield returns." "And you have documentation of these loans?" "My husband's signature." Wilson's smile tightened. "Of course. Everything is in order, I assure you." He slid several papers across the desk. Faith examined them carefully, recognizing Thomas's distinctive signature on each. The dates spanned the last 2 years of their marriage, precisely when Thomas had been most distant, most secretive. "I see," Faith said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "And what are these alternative arrangements you mentioned?" Wilson leaned back in his chair. "I'm a reasonable man, Miss Zimmerman. I understand that $2,000 is beyond your means. I'm prepared to forgive the debt entirely under certain conditions." Faith's skin prickled with warning. "What conditions?" "2 options," Wilson said, his gaze suddenly cold and calculating. "First, you could transfer ownership of your cottage to me as payment. You would be permitted to continue living there as my tenant for a nominal rent. And the second option, leave Wasco, immediately and permanently. Sign the property over to the bank, and I'll provide you with enough money for passage elsewhere and a modest fresh start." Faith stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you make such an offer? What do you gain from my departure?" Wilson's expression remained impassive. "Let's just say I have my reasons." "This has something to do with Xavier Hayes, doesn't it?" Faith pressed, sudden understanding dawning. "You and Miss Taylor are working together." A flicker of surprise crossed Wilson's face before he controlled it. "My business with Miss Taylor is separate from this matter." "I don't believe you," Faith said flatly. "What was your relationship with my husband really, Mr. Wilson? Thomas never mentioned you as a friend or business partner." Wilson's composure slipped momentarily. "Your husband understood the value of discretion, something you evidently lack." "I think," Faith said carefully, rising to her feet, "that I need time to consider your proposal." "You have until Friday," Wilson replied, his voice hardening. "After that, I'll have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure." Faith left the bank with her mind racing. Wilson's ultimatum made no sense unless there was something more at stake than a simple debt. The timing of Alina Taylor's arrival, the banker's inexplicable vendetta against her, all of it, pointed to a deeper conspiracy. Returning home, Faith found a note tucked into her door from Xavier, asking if she would join him for dinner at the hotel restaurant that evening. Her first instinct was to decline, to spare him involvement in her troubles, but Faith was beginning to realize that facing problems alone was a habit born of necessity, not wisdom. At precisely 7 o'clock, Faith entered the Wasco Hotel's modest dining room to find Xavier waiting, looking handsome in a clean shirt and waistcoat. His face lit up at the sight of her, a reaction that still startled Faith with its genuine warmth. "You look beautiful," he said, rising to hold her chair. "Thank you," Faith replied, smoothing her best dress, a deep green that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. "I'm afraid I'm not very good company tonight." Xavier's expression turned concerned. "What's wrong?" Briefly, Faith considered deflecting his question, but the events of the day had left her too weary for pretense. She withdrew Wilson's letter from her reticule and passed it across the table. Xavier read it quickly, his brow furrowing. $2,000. That's outrageous." "It gets worse," Faith said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. She recounted her meeting with Wilson, including his ultimatum and the strange connection to Alina Taylor. "I knew Wilson was a snake, but this is beyond the pale," Xavier said when she finished, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Faith, let me help you. I can pay this debt." "No," Faith interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what they want. Either to drive me away or to make me so indebted to you that I become a burden." "You could never be a burden," Xavier protested. Faith reached across the table to touch his hand. "You say that now, but $2,000 is no small sum, even for you. And there's something else at play here that we don't understand. Why is Wilson so determined to separate us? What was his true relationship with Thomas?" Xavier turned his hand to capture hers. "Whatever his game is, we'll face it together. I meant what I said by the creek, Faith. I love you, and no amount of small-town scheming will change that." The simple declaration, spoken so earnestly in the middle of the hotel dining room where anyone might overhear, brought tears to Faith's eyes. "You shouldn't say such things where people can hear." "Let them hear," Xavier said with quiet determination. "In fact," he rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and to Faith's astonishment lowered himself to one knee beside her. A hush fell over the dining room as other patrons turned to stare. "Xavier, what are you doing?" Faith whispered, mortified and thrilled in equal measure. "Something I should have done the moment I knew my own heart," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Faith Zimmerman, I love you more than I thought it possible to love another person. I don't care what anyone in this town says or thinks about you, because I know the truth of your character. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The silence in the dining room was absolute. Faith was acutely aware of every pair of eyes fixed on them, of the collective breath held in anticipation of her answer. In that moment, she had a choice to retreat behind the protective walls she'd built over years of judgment and pain, or to trust in the love shining so clearly in Xavier's eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Rising to his feet, Xavier pulled Faith gently into his arms and kissed her, heedless of their audience. When they finally broke apart, she was surprised to hear scattered applause from a few of the diners. "Well, that's one way to announce an engagement," she said breathlessly. Xavier laughed, the sound joyous and unburdened. "I've never been one for half measures." As they resumed their seats, Faith caught sight of a leaner tailor standing in the doorway of the dining room, her face a mask of controlled fury. The blonde woman turned on her heel and departed without a word. "Wilson won't take this lying down," Faith warned as they finished their meal, the initial excitement giving way to practical concerns. "Friday's deadline still stands." "Let me worry about Wilson," Xavier said confidently. "I think it's time I paid a visit to the county records office in Bakersfield. There's something not right about these loans, and I intend to find out what it is." The next morning, Xavier rode out early for Bakersfield, promising to return by nightfall. Faith spent the day alternating between giddy happiness at their engagement and gnawing anxiety about Wilson's machinations. By late afternoon, she was too restless to stay indoors and decided to visit the creek where Xavier had first declared his love. The peaceful spot was just as beautiful as she remembered. Faith settled on the fallen log, listening to the water's gentle melody and trying to quiet her racing thoughts. She didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until a horse nickered nearby, startling her from her reverie. "Miss Zimmerman," Bartholomew Wilson said, dismounting with fluid grace. "What a fortunate coincidence." Faith stood quickly, her heart racing. "There's nothing fortunate about it. How did you know I was here?" Wilson smiled thinly. "Wasco is a small town. People talk." He approached slowly, like a predator stalking prey. "I understand congratulations are in order. Your engagement to Hayes has the whole town buzzing." "Thank you," Faith replied warily. "If you've come about the debt, Xavier and I will discuss our options when he returns from Bakersfield." Something flickered in Wilson's eyes. "Bakersfield, you say? How interesting." "What do you want, Mr. Wilson?" Faith demanded, suddenly tired of the banker's games. "The same thing I've always wanted, Faith. Justice." The veneer of civility dropped from his voice. "Did you know that Thomas and I were more than business partners? We were like brothers." Faith frowned. "Thomas never mentioned you." "Of course he didn't," Wilson spat. "Not after you turned him against me. Not after you made his life so miserable he was forced to seek comfort elsewhere." "That's not what happened," Faith protested. "Thomas was unfaithful long before." "Lies," Wilson's shout echoed across the creek. "Always lies with you. Thomas told me everything: how cold you were, how you denied him a proper wife's duty, how you drove him to desperation." Faith took a step back, suddenly afraid. Wilson's eyes held a fanatical gleam she'd never seen before. "You're not well, Mr. Wilson. I think you should leave." "I'm not going anywhere until you admit the truth," he insisted, advancing on her. "Thomas borrowed that money for you to buy you jewels and dresses, anything to make you happy. And how did you repay him? With coldness and contempt." "That's not true," Faith said firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "Thomas spent that money on other women, on gambling, on his own pleasures." Wilson lunged forward suddenly, grabbing Faith's wrist. "You destroyed him, and now you think you can simply move on with Hayes. I won't allow it." Faith struggled to free herself, panic rising in her throat. "Let me go." "Not until you sign over that cottage," Wilson hissed. "Not until you're ruined, just as you ruined Thomas." With strength born of desperation, Faith wrenched her arm free and shoved Wilson hard. The banker stumbled backward, lost his footing on the Slick Creek bank, and fell heavily. His head struck a rock with a sickening crack, and he lay still, a thin stream of blood trickling into the water. "Mr. Wilson," Faith called, her voice trembling. When he didn't move, she cautiously approached, kneeling beside him to check for signs of life. To her relief, his chest still rose and fell, though he remained unconscious. Faith's mind raced. She couldn't leave him here, but neither could she move him alone. Reluctantly, she mounted Wilson's horse and rode as fast as she dared back to town, heading straight for Dr. Morgan's office. "Doctor." "Morgan," she called, dismounting in a flurry of skirts. "Please, I need help." The elderly doctor emerged from his office, eyebrows raised at her disheveled appearance. "Miss Zimmerman." "What on earth?" "It's Bartholomew Wilson," Faith explained breathlessly. "He's injured by the creek west of town. He fell and hit his head on a rock. He's breathing but unconscious." Dr. Morgan didn't waste time with questions. "Mrs. Perkins," he called to Wilson's secretary, who happened to be passing by. "Fetch Sheriff Davis and tell him to meet us at Mill Creek with a wagon. Mr. Wilson's been injured." Within minutes, a small party including the doctor, the sheriff, and 2 deputies was heading for the creek, with Faith leading the way. She explained as much as she felt was safe about the confrontation, omitting Wilson's more threatening behavior to focus on his fall. When they reached the creek, Wilson was beginning to stir, moaning incoherently. Dr. Morgan examined him quickly, his experienced hands gentle but thorough. "Concussion, certainly," he announced. "Possibly a fracture. We need to get him back to town immediately." As the men carefully lifted Wilson onto a stretcher, his eyes flickered open, fixing on Faith with undisguised hatred. "She pushed me," he slurred. "Tried to kill me." Sheriff Davis glanced sharply at Faith. "Is that true, Miss Zimmerman?" "He grabbed me," Faith explained, showing the bruises forming on her wrist. "I pushed him away in self-defense and he lost his balance. I never intended for him to be hurt." The sheriff's weathered face betrayed nothing. "We'll sort this out back in town. For now, you'd better come along with us." The ride back to Wasco was the longest of Faith's life. By the time they reached town, a crowd had gathered, whispers and speculation spreading like wildfire. Faith felt the familiar weight of judgment descending as she was escorted to the sheriff's office. "Wait here," Sheriff Davis instructed, leaving her in a small anteroom while he conferred with the doctor and deputies. Through the window, Faith could see the town's reaction unfolding. Mrs. Holbrook and her sewing circle had congregated on the boardwalk, their expressions ranging from smug vindication to gleeful scandal. Several men stood outside the saloon, gesturing in the direction of the sheriff's office. Even the children seemed to sense the excitement, lingering near their parents to catch forbidden snippets of adult conversation. Faith closed her eyes, weariness washing over her. Perhaps Wilson would get his wish after all. Even if she avoided legal consequences, her reputation in Wasco, already precarious, would be irreparably damaged. Who would believe her version of events over that of the respected bank president? The door opened, and Sheriff Davis entered with Dr. Morgan. "Miss Zimmerman, doctor." "Morgan has examined Mr. Wilson more thoroughly and would like to speak with you." The elderly doctor sat across from Faith, his kind eyes troubled. "Mr. Wilson is conscious now, though quite confused. He's claiming you lured him to the creek and attempted to murder him over some debt." "That's absurd," Faith protested. "I went to the creek alone to think. He followed me there and became aggressive when I refused to sign over my property." Dr. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. I see. Sheriff, I should mention that I've treated Mr. Wilson several times over the past year for increasing episodes of, well, let's call it nervous excitement. He's been under considerable strain since his wife's passing, and I've observed concerning changes in his behavior. Sheriff Davis frowned. Are you suggesting he's not of sound mind, Doc? I'm suggesting we should consider all possibilities before rushing to judgment, Dr. Morgan replied diplomatically. Especially given Miss Zimmerman's visible injuries. The sheriff turned to Faith. We'll need a formal statement, and I may need to hold you until Mr. Hayes returns, given the serious nature of the accusations. I understand, Faith said quietly. Just then, a commotion erupted outside hoofbeats, voices raised in greeting, and the unmistakable sound of Xavier's deep voice demanding answers. Moments later, the door burst open and Xavier strode in, his face tight with worry. Faith, he exclaimed, crossing the room in 2 strides to take her hands. Are you all right? I returned to town and heard the wildest stories. I'm fine, she assured him, relief washing over her at his presence. But Mr. Wilson is injured and he's accusing me of attempting to murder him. Xavier's expression darkened dangerously. That's ridiculous. Mr. Hayes, Sheriff Davis interrupted. While I appreciate your concern, this is a serious matter that requires, it's about to get more serious, Xavier cut in, withdrawing several folded documents from his coat. I've spent the day in Bakersfield reviewing county records. Sheriff, you might be interested to know that the loans Mr. Wilson claims Thomas Zimmerman took out don't appear in the official bank records. The only documentation is in Wilson's private files. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. Are you suggesting forgery? I'm suggesting worse, Xavier replied grimly. The county recorder also had records of a partnership agreement between Wilson and Zimmerman dating back 5 years. It seems they jointly owned several properties, including a certain establishment in Bakersfield. Faith frowned. What kind of establishment? Xavier hesitated. The kind that explains where Thomas went on his business trips. Understanding dawned slowly. A brothel, Faith whispered, pieces falling into place. Thomas and Wilson owned a brothel together, Doctor. Morgan cleared his throat uncomfortably. That would explain certain, medical issues Thomas consulted me about before his death. According to the records, Xavier continued, the establishment was profitable, but after Thomas died, ownership should have transferred partly to Faith as his widow. Instead, Wilson somehow claimed full ownership. He's been stealing from me, Faith realized. All this time, while spreading rumors about my character, he's been profiting from that place. Sheriff Davis studied the documents Xavier had brought, his expression growing increasingly grave. This changes things considerably. Miss Zimmerman, I believe we can dismiss Mr. Wilson's accusations given this new evidence and Dr. Morgan's observations about his mental state. What about Wilson? Xavier asked. Once he's well enough to travel, I'll escort him to the county seat to face charges of fraud, at minimum, the sheriff replied. Possibly more, depending on what else we discover. Faith sat in stunned silence as the men discussed legal matters. The revelation about Thomas and Wilson's business dealings explained so much. Thomas's unexplained absences, his gradual moral deterioration, Wilson's irrational hatred of her. While the knowledge brought no joy, it offered something perhaps more valuable, vindication. As they left the sheriff's office, the crowd outside had grown. Faith steeled herself for more whispers and judgment, but to her surprise, Dr. Morgan stepped forward to address the onlookers. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced in his authoritative physician's voice, I feel it is my duty to correct some misunderstandings. Miss Zimmerman acted entirely in self-defense when Mr. Wilson suffered his injury. Furthermore, evidence has come to light suggesting Mr. Wilson has been engaging in fraudulent activities concerning the late Thomas Zimmerman's estate. I would advise against spreading unfounded rumors, as they may constitute slander. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Holbrook looked particularly deflated, while several of the men exchanged significant glances. Xavier placed a protective arm around Faith's shoulders. "Shall we?" he asked quietly. They walked through the parting crowd with heads high, neither speaking until they reached Faith's cottage. Once inside, Faith's composure finally crumbled. She sank onto the sofa, tears flowing freely. All these years, she wept, all the whispers, the judgment, the shame, and Thomas was the one involved in that. Xavier sat beside her, drawing her into his arms. "I'm sorry, Faith. No one should have to endure what you have. The worst part is that I still loved him, even knowing he was unfaithful," she admitted. "I mourned him sincerely. What does that say about me?" "It says you're a woman of extraordinary compassion and integrity," Xavier replied, stroking her hair gently. "It says you honor your commitments, even when others don't deserve your loyalty." Faith looked up at him, her eyes still bright with tears. "How can you possibly want to marry me after all this?" Xavier's smile was tender. "Faith Zimmerman, every new thing I learn about you only confirms what I already knew, that you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Nothing Wilson or anyone else says could change that." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I had planned a more romantic setting for this, but after today's events, I don't want to wait another moment." Opening the box revealed a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained. "I've carried it with me since she died, waiting for the right woman to wear it." Faith's breath caught. "Xavier, it's beautiful." "Not nearly as beautiful as you," he replied, slipping the ring onto her finger. "A perfect fit, just as I knew it would be." In the days that followed, Wasco witnessed a remarkable transformation. As news of Wilson's fraud spread, coupled with revelations about his and Thomas's unsavory business ventures, the town's attitude toward Faith shifted dramatically. Those who had been her harshest critics suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of public opinion. Mrs. Holbrook made a point of stopping Faith after church to invite her to join the sewing circle. Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith who had once crossed the street to avoid her, offered to repair her garden gate free of charge. Even Mrs. Perkins, Wilson's loyal secretary, approached Faith to apologize for her years of coldness. Faith accepted these overtures with grace, neither gloating in her vindication nor rejecting sincere attempts at reconciliation. She understood better than most how easily reputations could be built and destroyed on the foundation of gossip. Eleanor Taylor departed Wasco without farewell, her banking connections suddenly less valuable in light of Wilson's disgrace. Wilson himself was transferred to the county jail once Dr. Morgan deemed him fit to travel, facing multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement. Through it all, Xavier remained steadfast, his faith in Faith never wavering. They were married in a simple ceremony at the creek where he had first declared his love, with Dr. Morgan officiating and a surprisingly large contingent of townspeople in attendance. "I take you, Faith Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Xavier vowed, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle murmur of the water. "I promise to trust you completely and cherish you always, to stand beside you in good times and bad, and to never doubt the love I see so clearly in your eyes." Faith's answering vows were equally heartfelt. "I take you, Xavier Hayes, to be my husband, my partner, and my dearest friend. I promise to be faithful in word and deed, to build our life together on foundations of honesty and trust, and to love you more with each passing day." As they exchanged rings beneath the dappled shade of the ancient oaks, Faith felt the last shadows of her past finally receding. The whispers that had followed her for so long were replaced by genuine well-wishes and celebrations. At the small reception held at the Double H Ranch, Faith found herself momentarily alone on the porch, watching Xavier chatting animatedly with their guests. Dr. Morgan approached, offering her a glass of punch. "Quite a change from a few weeks ago," he observed, nodding toward the townspeople mingling happily in the yard. Faith smiled. "People believe what's easiest to believe, Doctor. For a long time, that meant thinking the worst of me. And now they've found a new story that's easier to accept," she replied without bitterness. "The vindicated widow and her gallant husband." Dr. Morgan chuckled. "You're wiser than your years, Mrs. Hayes." The new name still sent a thrill through Faith. "Mrs. Hayes," she repeated softly. "I'm still getting used to that." "It suits you," the doctor said kindly, "just as he does." As if sensing they were discussing him, Xavier looked up, his gaze finding Faith across the gathering. The love in his eyes was unmistakable, unwavering, and completely without doubt. "Yes," Faith agreed, returning her husband's smile. "Just as he does." 5 years later, Faith sat on the porch of the Double H Ranch's expanded main house, watching Xavier teaching their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to ride a gentle pony in the yard. Their infant daughter, Margaret, slept peacefully in Faith's arms, her tiny features a perfect blend of both parents. The Double H had prospered under their joint care, expanding to become one of the most successful ranches in California. Faith had proven to have a remarkable head for business, keeping the books with precision and suggesting innovative improvements that increased their profits year after year. Wasco had grown as well, the railroad's arrival 2 years prior bringing new residents and opportunities. Faith's cottage in town had been sold to a young doctor and his wife, the proceeds invested in additional grazing land for the ranch. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly as the pony completed a circle with Xavier walking alongside, one hand ready to catch the boy if needed. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, sweetheart," Faith called back, her heart full. "You're doing wonderfully." Xavier looked up, his smile as bright as the day they'd met. At 35, the years had only enhanced his handsome features, adding distinguished touches of silver at his temples. Later, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Faith sat together on the porch swing, enjoying the cool evening breeze. Faith rested her head against her husband's shoulder, content in the comfortable silence they had cultivated over their years together. "I received a letter today," Xavier said eventually, "from the warden at San Quentin." Faith tensed slightly. "Wilson," Xavier nodded. "He's dying. Consumption, apparently. He's asked to see you." Faith considered this unexpected request. Bartholomew Wilson had received a 15-year sentence for his crimes, with no possibility of early release. She had not thought of him in years, had purposely put him and all he represented firmly in the past. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Whatever brings you peace, my love. If seeing him would provide closure, then we'll go together. If you'd rather not reopen old wounds, that's perfectly understandable." Faith smiled at the careful neutrality of his response. After 5 years of marriage, Xavier still took pains never to dictate her choices or question her judgment. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to see him, not for his sake but for my own, to close that chapter completely." 2 weeks later, they stood in the austere visiting room of San Quentin prison. Bartholomew Wilson was barely recognizable, his once imposing frame wasted by disease, his face gaunt and sallow. "Faith," he rasped when they were led to his table. "You came." "Yes," she replied simply, taking the seat across from him. Xavier remained standing behind her, a silent pillar of support. Wilson's rheumy eyes moved between them. "You look well, both of you." "Thank you," Faith said. "I understand you're unwell. I'm sorry to hear it." A bitter laugh dissolved into coughing. "Always so proper," Wilson managed when he recovered. "Even now." "Why did you ask to see me, Mr. Wilson?" The dying man stared at her for a long moment. "I wanted to see if you were happy," he admitted finally. "If all my efforts to destroy you had failed completely." Faith might have been angered by his honesty, but found she could summon only pity. "They failed," she confirmed gently, "but I didn't come to gloat." "No, you wouldn't," Wilson murmured. "Thomas never understood that about you. Your fundamental decency." Faith felt Xavier's hand on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "Thomas made his choices," she said. "As did you." Wilson nodded weakly. "I loved him, you know, not as a brother, as I told people, more than that." The confession hung in the air between them, explaining so much about Wilson's irrational hatred, his obsessive campaign against her. "I suspected as much," Faith acknowledged. "Did Thomas know?" "I never told him directly," Wilson replied, his gaze distant with memory. "But I think he knew. He used it, certainly. Used me." Faith absorbed this final piece of the puzzle that had been her first marriage. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "That must have been painful for you." Wilson's eyes refocused on her, surprise evident in their depths. "You truly are a remarkable woman, Faith Hayes. I see now what Hayes found in you." He glanced up at Xavier. "Take care of her. She deserves that much." "I intend to," Xavier replied, his first words since entering the room. "Every day for the rest of our lives." When they left San Quentin, Faith felt lighter somehow, as if the last lingering shadow had finally been banished from her life. She took Xavier's arm as they walked toward their waiting carriage. "Thank you for coming with me," she said, "for supporting my decision." Xavier stopped walking to face her, his expression serious. "I will always support you, Faith, always trust you, always believe in you." "I know," she replied, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "That's why I love you." The journey back to Wasco seemed shorter somehow, filled with quiet conversation and comfortable silences. As their carriage crested the final hill overlooking the valley where the Double H spread out below them, the setting sun painted everything in hues of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," Faith murmured, leaning against her husband's side. "Everything we've built together." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "And we're only just beginning." In the distance, they could see the ranch house lights glowing warmly, their children waiting safely inside with Mrs. Garcia, who had become a dear friend and occasional nanny. Beyond the main house stood the bunkhouse where their loyal ranch hands lived, the new barn they had raised last summer, and the flourishing orchards Faith had insisted on planting. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Faith asked as the carriage began its descent toward home. "If you had believed the gossip about me like everyone else?" Xavier considered her question seriously. "I can imagine many different paths my life might have taken," he said finally. "But none where I failed to recognize the truth of who you are, Faith Hayes. Some things are simply meant to be." As the carriage pulled up to their home, the front door burst open and Thomas ran out, pajama-clad and ignoring Mrs. Garcia's calls to wait. Xavier jumped down to scoop up their son, swinging him high in the air to delighted squeals. Faith descended more carefully, accepting Mrs. Garcia's apologetic smile and report that Margaret had just been put down after her evening feeding. Together, the family entered the house that had become a true home, filled with laughter, trust, and unwavering love. Later, as they prepared for bed, Faith caught Xavier watching her with that same look of wonder she had first noticed years ago outside the telegraph office in Wasco. "What is it?" she asked, smiling at his reflection in the mirror as she brushed out her hair. "I was just thinking," he said, moving to stand behind her, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders, "about how fortunate I am to be the man who gets to love you." Faith set down her brush and turned to face him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "And I am equally fortunate to be loved by you, Xavier Hayes, the man who trusted me completely when no one else would." In the quiet of their bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the curtains, they reaffirmed the vows they had made beside the creek 5 years earlier, vows of trust, faithfulness, and a love that would never be questioned, only celebrated with each passing day.